I'm going to show you how to create transitions that have a specific direction. This is something that I've been implementing in multiple projects, and for example, this is one of my side projects. This has some navigation tabs that have directional transitions based on the tab positions. So if I click a tab that is on the left, it new continent transitions from the left, and if it's on the right, it transitions from the right. Another example that I created was a Next.js app transition that transitions between routes, also with this same implementation. And this also works with this browser history, back and forward buttons. So this is a bit tricky to implement, so I'm going to show you how to do it in a very stripped down basic version. It won't look very fancy, but in order to keep it as simple as possible, so it will be easy to follow along. So the easiest development environment to use is Code Sandbox. So let's head over to Code Sandbox, create a new sandbox with the rack template. And once it loads, we can add the dependency framer motion that we'll be using. And initially we need the different, let's say, tabs, so we can define those in an array. Const tabs equals an array of 1, 2, and 3. And we need to map these, or we need to have a current tab selected state. So let's define that. Const current set current use state, and the initial state should be tabs 0, so the first. And we can render this out in a motion div, and render this current inside an h1 tag. And let's create a way to switch between the states with a bunch of buttons. Let's also wrap this in div element div and map through the tabs, tab, and return a button element. Let's also add a key to it and a on click handler that remove the side panel. And on click, this should update the state to this current tab. So now we have a way to switch between the states. And in order to animate this, we need to wrap this motion component inside an animate presence fire order component. So this gives the motion component some properties that will be transitioned when the component comes in and when it leaves. And these properties are initial, let's call this enter, animate, which should be the final position of the component. Let's call this in, and then exit. Let's call this exit. And these states are defined, should be defined with variants. So enter key should have the value of, let's say, opacity 0. So that's the initial state. The what did I call it? In should be opacity 1, and exit should be again opacity 0. So now we have these 3 states, and if I click it now, so nothing happens because Drag thinks that this motion div component is the same, but only the internal string changes. What's this? Ignore that for now. But we want to treat them as different components, so we will add a key here, which should be current. So the current tab, current state. So now if we click on this, a transition in will happen, turning the opacity from 0 to 1, and when it transitions out, the opacity will turn from 1 to 0 again. But there's a little bit of a problem that these multiple components will be shown at the same time, so they will push each other's layout in a way that kind of makes it confusing. So what we actually want to do is lay these motion components on top of each other, so you will use the same position. One way to do it simply is to use a position absolute, oh, sorry, style equals position absolute. Now they are on top of each other, what we want, but the position absolute makes the layout a bit tricky because it takes it out of the traditional layout order, and yeah, you have to recenter it and do all sorts of shenanigans in order to make it work with the regular layout. So a nice, oh, I'm just going to illustrate also if we have like a something after this element. Let's call it an h2 tag of a footer. Then this footer will also ignore this position absolute and lay on top of that. So this is what we don't want. So let's remove this position absolute for now and use a different technique, which is a position or display grid. So display grid. Let's actually use an online editor so we can follow along, which is a grid, interactive grid building app thing that you can find on grid.layoutit.com. And no, we don't need any specific heights for the grid elements. For the width, we only need 3 rows. one is buttons, one is content, and one is footer. So now we can just copy this code, paste it in here. We don't need the columns because we only have one, and we don't need the gap since the gap is 0. And we need these 3 elements inside the grid itself. One is buttons that we already defined. Let's just give it a class name called buttons. One is a motion div. Let's give it a class name with a capital N of content, and the footer class is footer. So now that we have this content in this grid area content, all the elements, if they are even duplicated, they will always be in this middle grid laid on top of each other. So this preserves the layout, but also ensures that the content will lay on top of each other. So yeah, this is a much better solution than the position absolute. So now for the transitions. For example, if we define another position property for the entering state, for example, x is 100, you can see that okay, it starts from the right. We need to transition it to x0, and now we can see it always comes in from the right. But we don't want it to be always from the right. We want it to start from the either from the right or the left. So we need to define the condition when it comes in from the left. So we have to know 2 states. So basically the current state and the new state, or rather the current state and the previous state, so we can compare the positions. One way to we have the current state, but we also need the previous state, so we need to somehow store that previous state. One way to do it is to use a React hook. There's a nice library called React use that has a bunch of very useful hooks that I've been using in projects. One we're looking for is use previous. So basically what this does is it stores the value of the state and returns it, but updates not on render, but after the render. So it always returns the previous state. So we can just copy this because we don't need a whole library. Let's paste it in here. Let's remove the types. We don't need TypeScript for this project. I usually use TypeScript, but since some of you might not, I'll use vanilla. We need these use ref and use effect. Import it in, use effect. And now we can use this hook and store it in a variable called previous and pass in our current. So now we have both the current and the previous. Log this out just to check if it works correctly. Current, current and previous. So if we click 3 and then 1, we can see that, okay, previous was 3 and the current is 1. So this works correctly. And now we need to compare these in order to return a value that these gives us the direction of the new value. So is it on the right or the left? One way to do it is just to store this in a variable. Let's call it direction. Let's compare two indexes of the array. So take the whole array, find out the index of the current one and compare it to, is it smaller than index of the previous one? So is the current smaller than the previous? If it is, return false. So we can use this in the enter value. So if it is smaller, return -100, but if it's bigger, return 100. So now we have this direction. So if it's on the right, animate from the right, but if it's on the left, animate from the left. But now we would assume that we can do this, just copy it to the exit as well, reverse the direction, and it should work. But for some reason, sometimes it does some weird stuff, and it's not quite intuitive to understand what's going on here. And the problem is that when you pass in the exit property, this doesn't get updated because the component is already sort of unmounted, not in the Rect tree. So Rect says that, oh, okay, this is officially not in the tree. We shouldn't update its props. So animate presence gives a custom property that can still pass values into the internals. So let's pass in the current value so we can use it in our exit. And the way to use it is not to return an object, but a function that returns an object. Now we have this current, which is the freshest current, and we want to do the comparison here again. So let's do the comparison, use the fresh current, replace this, and instead of previous, because the state will be once like older, we can use the old current. So this is the fresh current and this is the previous current, basically. And let's reverse the direction as well. And now we have this implemented correctly. So yeah, this is like the bare bones, very basic version of implementing a direction for the transitions. So now we can make this a little bit nicer, maybe define a transition. The default transition is of type spring. We can add a, what were the values called? Wish I had TypeScript here. One was called damping, I believe, and another one was called stiffness, maybe. Oh, let's just look at the docs real quick Framer motion docs. See, okay, types of animation, spring. Okay, this has damping and stiffness. Okay, stiffness, damping should be correct. If I lower the damping, it should be more bouncy. Transition, okay, I misspelled it. So now we have a bit of a smoother transition here. Maybe we could also lower the duration of the opacity, so we can define per property transitions with opacity duration 0.2. So now the opacity transition is faster, which is quite nice. And we can start tweaking stuff like maybe add a scale from 0.5 to 1, back to 0.5, stuff like this. And we can start playing around with it, maybe lower from 0, and basically start styling these transitions. Maybe this content width 400 pixels, height 300 pixels, background yellow. Okay, now this scaling is quite ridiculous, but I can start playing around. Margin, photo, so center it, display, grid, line items, center. Okay, now the scale looks ridiculous. Let's bump this down a little bit. 0.7 maybe. And let's increase this from 100 to maybe 300. It's a little bit too fast, maybe. Slow this down. So yeah, we can keep tweaking it forever for their radius and pixels. But basically, this is the way to do it. I hope you learned something and can use this in your own project as well. If you're interested, I have a Twitter account called Mick Martin, and I also post these types of front-end development stuff and like the small interactions, and feel free to follow me. And if you find something that you like and would like to know how to implement it, just let me know in the comments down below. That's basically it. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.